thank you for coming on, Miss. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
No worries, Ali.
So I thought this podcast we could talk about teaching and then maybe onto politics. Does that sound good?
Yep, two things I'm interested in, yep.
Okay, so the first thing with teaching, because you teach English, right?
Yeah, I teach English and I teach history and also society and culture.
So you teach three... is there a term for those?
Talented, I think you'd call it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm a talented teacher.
But like, are there
Well, I suppose you'd think maybe about the history and the society and culture being sort of humanities-based subjects and then English.
Yeah, okay. So with English, namely, do you ever get sick of the text that you read year after year after year?
There's probably some that over time I've become a little bit bored with, particularly if I start to find that it's a text that there's not a lot of substance in. Most of the texts I've taught I haven't become bored with because we've got a little bit of flexibility as English teachers to make some choices about the texts that we teach. So I would generally try to select texts that I know I'm interested in, that I know is going to maintain my interest, and hopefully if I'm interested and I'm enthusiastic about what I'm teaching, then the students I'm teaching can pick up on that. So mostly the texts that I teach I don't get bored with. That's because I've had quite a great deal of say in the texts that I'm teaching.
Yeah. And with the students, you mentioned students. I've always found this fascinating. Like it blows my mind. So with casual teachers, right? You know how there's normally when the casual teacher comes in, the students are like, yeah, whatever. Like they're not really engaged. How do you make sure, like, how do you command respect, not command respect, but how do you make them engaged? How do you make it an engaging classroom?
Yeah, and I think it's different from teacher to teacher, but I think there's probably some similar traits across good teachers. And I think one of them is relationships with students. And I think if you can build a rapport with the kids that you're teaching, and by that I don't mean that you become their friend or you're their mate, but it's really about sort of a mutual respect, letting them see a little bit of your personality and who you are, encouraging them to show a little bit of their personality and including that in the classroom. And I think that that's very beneficial to building a positive environment so the kids are a little bit more engaged. I think that the more passionate you are as a teacher about the subject that you're teaching helps to contribute to a particular type of classroom environment where learning's more likely to happen. And that's not that that's always a perfect situation, because it's not. And I think it's an unbelievable difficult job being a casual teacher, walking into different sorts of curriculum, picking up work on a day, and then going into students who can smell a casual teacher, a mile away. It's like they smell blood.
Yeah, once you see a casual teacher,
well, yeah,
blood period.
Even the good kids at times. And so I think that I've got the benefit of being a permanent teacher in a school, and that the students know me very well. Many of them I've taught for a number of years, and I think that gives me probably some sort of benefit that casual teachers wouldn't necessarily have. But I certainly think that trying to foster some really good relationships with students, making sure that and I suppose when you're disciplining students, it's not so much about, really firm and harsh sort of language and harsh consequences. It's more just sort of redirection and trying not to put students on show, I think, is a really important thing. If there's times when you needed to have a conversation with a student, to try and have it privately, because, students have got pride as well. And I think particularly, students who are put on show, they can sometimes react really badly to that sort of thing, and that fractures any sort of relationship that you're trying to develop. So they're probably some of the things I've found worked well for me.
So you think it's important to be friendly with the student, but not too friendly. You don't want to be Michael from The Office.
Hell no. Yeah, I do. I think that sort of relationship is the one that's most beneficial for the teacher as well as the student, because ultimately we're trying to achieve the same goal. And it is a bit of a partnership between teachers and students. And so while there is a clear relationship and there's clear boundaries to that relationship, there's also opportunities there to get to know each other a little bit and to humanise the teacher, humanise the students. And I think that there's a great deal of benefits to the education that can happen when that's the sort of relationship that exists.
Well put.
Thanks.
I also wanted to ask about when you first got into teaching, what were your thoughts, or what did you think it was going to be like, and how has that changed over time?
Look, I think I'm a better teacher now than I was when I first started teaching.
I'd hope so.
Yeah, me too. But I think I came into the profession because I had a real passion for the subjects that I taught. So, you know, I loved history, I loved literature, and I loved sociology when I was at university. And I suppose with that sort of breadth of interest, there's probably very few careers that you can actually go into where you get to do the things that you love and the things that you studied and were passionate about at university. And I was passionate about those things in high school as well. And so education seemed a pretty logical profession for me. And I remember I didn't really have any idea of what teaching was like. And I didn't really feel once I was in a classroom that my degree was helpful in how to actually manage a classroom. I had all of these theories about, about cognitive development and so on. But really, once I was in a classroom on a prac, then I started to learn what it really meant to be a teacher. And I loved it. I enjoyed my prac teaching so much. I was at 3 different schools in pretty low socioeconomic areas. At one of them, and this hopefully would never happen now, but the teacher who was my supervisor basically was sick most of my prac, and I ended up teaching their whole load as well, which is more than you're meant to do. But I felt that the head teacher, while supervising me, also gave me a bit of autonomy about what I was doing as well. So I think I really learnt. And I think teaching's a bit of a sink or swim sort of situation. And certainly that's kind of the beginning of my career was a little bit like that. It was a bit disrupted. The faculty that I came into was maybe a little bit disrupted at the time. And so I sort of was in the deep end, and I was either going to, survive it and enjoy it or not. And I did. I loved it. It's not to say that it wasn't hard. And I certainly had a lot to learn. But I think about teaching now, and I think that there's so much administration associated with teaching. There's so many things external to a classroom. But the thing I still like the most about my day is teaching. It's still an enjoyable thing for me, an enjoyable process. I love being in the classroom.
Yeah. And when did you realize that you wanted to be a teacher? Was it a thing that you thought, I'm going to be like while you were a student at school, or was it something that you eventually realized later on, maybe in university?
Yeah, I think it probably solidified for me at university, and probably more so once I actually did a prac. I mean, I was tossing up, doing crazy things like joining the federal police, becoming a lawyer. And now I think about those sorts of options, and I know what a poor fit they would have been for me. And I think, this long into my profession, the fact that I'm still very happy coming to work, it's very rare that I'm not here. That I'm still really happy being in a classroom. I'm still excited by curriculum, that I still get very passionate about, some novel that I'm teaching or a bit of Shakespeare. Not that the kids are always as passionate, but that's their issue. I think that says that I'm in the right profession.
Well, that's the teaching side part of it out of the way. Now we're going to get into the good bit.
Was that
politics.
Boring? Was it, Ali?
No. No, I think you did really well, I guess, answering the teaching stuff.
You'd hope so. Been doing it for a while.
Yeah. So, politics, right? I've started reading the other day the Communist Manifesto, and I just wanted to talk to you about that because you're a great source on left politics.
I suppose history in general, I suppose I've got quite a passion for, but I've got a bit of a passion for, Russian history and for, Karl Marx. I've read the Communist Manifesto myself when I was at university, and I've sort of looked at it at different times since then, but yes, I do have an interest in that.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about something in the Communist Manifesto that I thought about while reading. So obviously the book was made during the Industrial Revolution, not during the beginning but at the end, right?
Well, it's sort of a response to the Industrial Revolution, particularly the way that it seemed to be creating a particular type of society in Europe. And in particular, you're really looking at sort of the German example and the British example of industrialisation.
Yeah, and I thought, I'm not sure if you feel the same, but I thought it was a bit weird how because the French Revolution paved way to the Industrial Revolution, right?
It doesn't really pave way to it, because you've got to remember that the French Revolution isn't so much about industrialization. It's really about looking at French society and the huge inequalities that existed in political voice. So, French society had 3 estates, and the third estate, being the largest, was basically the peasantry, the people. And they had, the least say in the political situation. So you're dealing with a monarchy at that point. So even though the French Revolution is based on some of the principles that are akin to principles, within communism and the French Revolution are still pretty separate things.
Yeah. I thought it was pretty weird how we moved on from the extreme classes of lord and peasant, and then we transitioned to bourgeoisie and proletariat?
Yeah, proletariat.
Do you think that we can ever function or live in a society that doesn't have those classes?
Yeah, I think I'd love to say yes. And I think that really if we had a society which was a little bit fairer, then that would be a really wonderful thing, because I don't think there's a huge amount of equality. And I think as soon as you have very distinct classes which are based on economics, then I can't really imagine a society where those sorts of, I suppose, status associated with wealth. I can't see a society where that's not going to be the case. I suppose idealistically, I think that would be really wonderful if we actually valued people based on what they could contribute to a society, and we understood that everyone's contribution was of equal importance. And then I don't think we'd need classes at that point. But I can't imagine a world where somebody who feels as though they are more, I suppose, work harder or perhaps have a greater academic qualification shouldn't be receiving more money and therefore have more opportunities than somebody who may not be achieving either of those things. So even though I love the idea of a classless society, I can't see it happening. So I think that we will always have divisions in society based on economics, which will then define status, will be associated with how much power you then have, how much political say you then have. And I think that really moving forward as a society, it's about trying to make things more equal, and it's about trying to give opportunities to the people who have had less opportunities in the hope of sort of raising them up.
Yeah. Capitalism, or the whole idea behind it, it's enticing, isn't it? It's kind of saying the harder you work, the more successful you are. But that's not really the case. There are predetermined variables at play. Maybe your race, disabilities. There are a lot of things that kind of floor this very basic statement, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, people who are great supporters of capitalism love to, suggest that really your ability to get ahead in society is associated only with how hard you work. But, as you were just alluding to, we know that that's not the case, that there are many circumstantial issues which could be all kinds of things, and absolutely race is one of them. Being born a woman in some situations is one of them. Being born into families who have had less, educational opportunities is also another factor. People who are born into, lower socioeconomic areas where or into, cycles of different sorts of, generational abuse, generational unemployment. I mean, we're not being born on an equal playing field, and anyone who says that we are is deluding themselves, because there are so many. Think about the different parts of the world that you might be born into. Think about the migrant population, the refugee population in Australia, and think about whether or not those, people who spend time in detention centres or in refugee camps, when they get to Australia and they've missed years of education, potentially their education in their first language has been, so interrupted that they're not even literate in that language. And then we think that they're going to have the same opportunities as someone who was born in Australia to a doctor mother, a lawyer father, who are able to pay for private tuition, and they go to, an inner city school with lots of opportunity. I don't think that it's an even playing field at all.
So if the exploitation of workers from the higher class isn't the solution.
Exploitation from the higher class, that's not a solution.
Yeah, if it isn't, then what type of hybrid do we need to implement to make the best sort of society we can? Because we can't have something that's perfect. Obviously, utopias don't exist.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that you can't have one thing, like one extreme, and then expect that to work. You have to have principles taken from each and then implemented into one thing. What do you think we can take out from both capitalism and communism to make the most efficient political ideology?
Yeah, I think it's sort of like a political, social and economic ideology really that you're sort of pointing towards. And I think that, Australia actually has a great deal of sort of left-wing institutions already. The fact that we have free education is absolutely wonderful institution in Australia, and it's not the case everywhere.
We are lucky in Australia, aren't we?
I think we're hugely lucky. And aside from that, we've got free healthcare. I mean, you'd hate to be unwell in America at the moment without insurance and think about, what your outcome might be, because in Australia it's a very different situation. So I think we've got at least some of those sort of left institutions that already exist in Australia. However, then I also think about, the way that different governments look at our welfare system and who they think deserves support and who they think does not deserve support and the degree to which they deserve support. And I think that whenever you're trying to support people through that sort of welfare system in the lowest way that you possibly can, you don't give them an awful lot of opportunity to be sort of risen out of that, to try and level the playing field. And so if you think about, the fact that the NDIS didn't even exist in this country until a few years ago, and you think about what that meant for disabled people in our community for so long. So those sorts of initiatives are wonderful. They should have occurred a lot sooner. They probably should be funded in much larger amounts, and also they probably need less red tape so that it's easier for people to access. But you could look at sort of a gamut of welfare and sort of think about whether or not it's very generous, or is it we're just doing enough to make sure these people sort of survive, but we're not really doing enough to help them change their lives.
It's kind of like that equity and equality poster, the one with the three people. One of them is really short, one of them is medium height, and one of them can see at the top. And giving them what they require to make everything equal is, I guess, the better way, right? And is that socialism? Because my thought on socialism is non-existent because I don't know much about it.
Yeah, well, I think as soon as you're thinking about sort of socialism and communism, you're really bringing in sort of ideas about economics but also ideas about sort of classes and so on in society. And I think, really, if you're heading in that direction, it's really the assumption that everyone contributes evenly to society, that really we shouldn't have, a bourgeoisie, if you like, who are the smaller group, who have more access to power, control of sort of the economic wealth, and therefore more influence because of it. And then this huge mass of people who are holding them all up, and they're the ones who are working and working and working. And then they also tend to then have, children who end up in the same sort of status of society as they do. And I think, if you think about sort of communism, it's the idea that, well, the mass of people, the proletariat at some point are going to get very fed up with that system. They're going to look at it and think this is very unfair because, well, we're working very hard. We're contributing as a large portion of the society more than that very small amount who are controlling the economics. And, shouldn't we have, more access to that wealth. So like a redistribution, a fairer distribution of that wealth, because they're kind of getting wealthy off their labor. But then also, shouldn't we have more say? Shouldn't we have more political power? And even though you think about something like a democracy and that people all have the right to vote, if you've got a lot of people with wealth controlling things like media, then they're also kind of controlling some of the opinions. Yeah.
Isn't it implied that the more successful have more power? Because if power or political influence was spread evenly between everyone in society, it would be changed to a more even or fairer political system or a voting system.
Yeah, I think that Australia's got a fair voting system, for example, but I think that also that larger part of the population who have less power also have less influence because of that. So I think Australia's reasonably fair. I think it is, but I've also seen situations where certain parts of the media may have, represented certain political parties. I'll be careful what I'm saying here. Certain political parties in a more positive or a more negative light, and that has a great deal of influence on that large part of the population who are also susceptible to the media.
And my question is, if we look at it from a very surface point of view, capitalism has been doing pretty well, hasn't it? Over time.
I think it's doing pretty well for parts of society.
Yeah.
America would be the largest capitalist economy in the world. Think about the disadvantage in that society. So does capitalism work for everyone? Or does capitalism work for the people who can then continue to present the idea that it works well for everyone?
I understand what you're saying, but if you look at do you know much about Cuba and what that's like? Because I saw a video recently.
I know a bit about Cuba, yeah.
They're communists, so and
Are they?
Well, they're not truly communists, but
good. We've never seen communism.
Yeah,
we've seen versions that fit situations based on what a leader feels. So the Russian version, that's not communism. The Chinese, it's not communism. It's versions. Vietnam, not communism. North Korea, no. Yeah, there's elements which you could say are based on some communist principles, but these are not. If you've read the Communist Manifesto, or you continue to, you realise that, the Communist Manifesto is a utopian text. It's an imagined better version of a society. And so that is somebody writing in a context where they look at industrialisation and they think this is unfair. But you've got to remember during that period as well, this is before the way we imagine capitalism. Because in Australia, we've got capitalism, but then workers also have rights.
It was more blunt and extreme.
Yeah, well, imagine that you're a worker within one of these industrial societies and that you worked as many hours as your employer said you needed to work. In some instances, it meant that workers slept at factories or in tenant sort of houses attached to factories in the Russian situation, besides machinery at times. Imagine that there's no sick pay. So if you're sick, you potentially could lose your job. Extremely unsafe working conditions. So that sort of situation, that the people who are the most at risk, who are also not benefiting very much from the situation, are those workers. So, if you think about the capitalism we have in Australia, there's been some very beneficial things, because along with capitalism comes the opportunity for people to earn money and to pay taxes. The taxes then can be used to support sort of the welfare system. So a blending with probably a sort of a bit more of a lean towards supporting the people who really need support instead of the people who clearly are doing financially pretty well. I think that is a good solution.
And it's kind of how ironic how when you look at the Russian version of communism, it was kind of capitalism, wasn't it? The lower class working as much as they can to provide money for the government, who is just getting richer.
Yes and no in that sense. So if you think about very early communism under Lenin, he actually deliberately allowed a degree of capitalism. It was called the New Economic Policy, and the whole intention of it was basically to encourage the farmers, the peasants, to farm more, to feed the workers in the cities. And to do that, what he allowed was that they could farm for themselves, which is subsistence farming, but then they could also farm a little bit extra. So they could farm a surplus and they could sell that surplus, hence capitalism. But then there was also the, businesses that began to sort of rise up in the cities, and they're sort of small businesses originally, but ultimately you're creating sort of almost a middle class there who have some sort of ownership over businesses, which obviously is kind of against sort of the economic principles of communism. But that was a pragmatic thing, a very practical thing that Lenin did, because he needed the farmers to farm so that they could feed the workers in the cities. He needed business to start flourishing in the cities, and so he allows sort of this controlled capitalism is really what he allows. Stalin's a little bit different.
Yeah. Let's say.
Yeah, he's really different. And Stalin's different because the class of peasants who are created by Lenin are called kulaks, and one of the things that Stalin does almost immediately is to destroy that class. And destroy the netmen, sort of the little businessmen in the cities. By little, there was a reasonable amount of them. And by destroy, at times that meant death, or it meant a gulag. So he was really removing those elements that could be perceived as capitalism. And the situation in Russia really in many ways, as far as the economy and the way people worked, it is communist. However, it has all of these totalitarian elements to it. Which create like a state of terror, a state of fear. And also you have this cult of personality and this almost worshipping of Stalin. So even though in Russia the situation almost becomes one where if you were working in the city, even under Stalin, and you had a family of 4 people, then you would be given a large enough residence for those 4 people. You would work, you'd be considered, no matter what you were contributing in society, no matter the job, equal to the other person. That's yes. However, you could also have a neighbour think that you said something mean about Stalin and dob you in, and then you could end up in a gulag the next week. So there's some parts which are probably what you might expect from communism, but there's a great deal that is not communism, it's Stalinism. It's his version.
Why was Stalin's communism or his introduction to communism so well received by the public?
Oh, I don't think it was well received. I think, and any reception that's positive around Stalin,
not during the time, but before he went crazy and started killing a lot of people. When he was trying to overthrow the Tsar.
Well, that's not him so much. He's one of the revolutionaries. That's Lenin. And so Vladimir Lenin is the man who participates in the revolution, and he takes power after the provisional government is overthrown. So there's like Tsar, Tsar abdicates, leaves the throne, you end up with a provisional government. The provisional government are then overthrown. It's actually pretty peaceful by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks seize power. And then you end up with Lenin. In control of Russia for, up till 1924 when he dies. And then there's a bit of a struggle for power between Stalin and Trotsky, and Stalin does a pretty good job of killing a lot of his political opponents, including Trotsky, so he removes his opposition. He then sort of presents himself as the rightful heir to Lenin's legacy by falsifying photographs and documents and all kinds of things. And then he takes power himself. But by then, he's kind of removed any other potential opposition, including the man who probably should have got the job, which is Trotsky. Certainly was, although I think Stalin is very politically savvy, ruthless. I think that Trotsky was probably the more principled of and more capable of the potential heirs to the Lenin legacy. And then Stalin kind of makes it his own. And a reason why maybe the Russian public appeared to love Stalin was probably the amount of brainwashing and that existed in the media, in education. History was rewritten. So he's written this entire version of sort of the revolution and his role in it that presents him as playing a role. There's photographs where he wasn't even there, and he's, now it's really funny to look at them with our eyes and understanding things like photoshopping. And he's actually been almost photoshopped in to some of these images. But the cult of personality develops over time, and there's songs written and the kids have to sing these songs. And, and with the removal really of a lot of the religious institutions in Russia, Stalin kind of sets himself up as the thing to be worshipped.
Mm. Do you think communism could have worked in Russia when Stalin was trying to introduce it? Obviously with a different person driving it, but could it have worked, or was it doomed from the beginning?
Yeah, I think probably one of the reasons it was doomed from the beginning is communism is really about societies who are industrialized. And when the revolution occurs in 1917, most of the Russian population are still peasant farmers, and communism is for sort of industrial city workers. And so immediately, as soon as that revolution happened, they are creating a different version of communism to fit the Russian situation. There's elements absolutely that could have worked, and there's elements that were working well under Lenin. However, like I was saying before, there was economic decline in the cities. There was this horrible treaty signed at the end of Russia's involvement in World War I with Germany, called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which, it takes huge portions of the Russian population, industrial areas, from them, destroys their economy. The revolution is occurring at the same time. So, and even before that,
the Industrial Revolution?
The Russian Revolution.
Oh, okay.
And people are starving in Russia, starving in the cities, starving in the countryside. There's a tremendous famine. And so how do you come to power in that situation and implement what is really, I suppose, a political and economic ideology, but with that situation and that diverse population? And remember, Russia's massive. And from one side of the country to the other side of the country, you've got people who don't even look similar. It is so diverse, that country. People speak different languages. People have different beliefs. Just the geographic expanse of Russia makes it an unbelievably difficult place to manage. Try and implement a new political and economic ideology in that situation. Yeah, I think it probably was doomed to fail.
What's your reply to the generic statement, it's great in theory, but it doesn't work in practice?
Well, we've never seen it work in practice. And I think that probably is true. In theory, it sounds wonderful. It is a utopia. It is a workers' utopia. And so I think it is true that, lovely in theory, doesn't work in practice, because I think human beings, unfortunately, are competitive by nature. And also, maybe if communism existed before anything else, before any other political or economic ideology, maybe it would work, because people wouldn't know anything else. But when you've got that sort of competition between people being encouraged, the whole idea of if you work really hard, then you'll achieve more in life and you'll do better, that is incompatible with communism in many ways. Although Stalin did encourage workers to work harder to produce more, but that was so they could get medals because they were helping Russia. So yeah, I think lovely ideology. There's certainly parts of it that I think are still valuable now. But I think it's probably impossible. I don't think we'll ever see it.
Yeah, I think the whole communism ideology would have worked better in simpler times, because now in today's society there's so many complexities. You can't...
How do you undo all of those?
Yeah.
We're too bureaucratic now to go in that direction at this point. Yeah, I completely agree.
Do you think it would have worked better before the Industrial Revolution? Maybe during medieval times?
Well, Karl Marx wasn't writing it for that sort of situation. He was writing it really because of what emerged because of industrialization. Medieval times, probably no, because you still had a hierarchical system. It was worse because instead of having workers, you had feudal serfs. You had people who were slaves, essentially. So how do you pull down that sort of power structure and replace it with a more equal society? Probably, the French Revolution's an example of trying.
And if anything, it just replaced it with another ideology with social classes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tyranny that causes in France. Even though, I'm not a monarchist, so I don't, not support, the principles of the French Revolution. I do, whether or not people require beheading to demonstrate that they're correct.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk about the riots that are happening in America.
Yeah.
So, is this as a result of America's America's suckiness? I don't know a better word for it. Is it?
Well, yeah. This is a culmination of their entire history and the deep divisions in that society which have never been dealt with. And, people can say, oh, well, there was the Civil War and that abolished slavery and, that was meant to create this fair society.
Not at all. Not at all.
No.
Slaves were around way after the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely they were. And I suppose there's an argument to suggest now that there's plenty of people in America who probably feel they're still enslaved to the system. And so I think to look at the riots that are going on now and think that it is just a reaction to the current context is to dismiss that this is a history from the very beginning when America was colonized by Europeans, and the treatment of the indigenous population there is the beginning of it. And they've got so much blood on their hands in America, and just there's been this consistent inability for it to be dealt with. And so now you're seeing people feeling empowered, who probably now, because of the way that media has changed, the fact that people can film and share things and organize protests online through different sorts of mediums, you're seeing this opportunity for the disempowered to sort of stand up. And I think there's more support for them than there probably has been in the past.
Mm. Do you think that after this whole ordeal is dealt with or dies down, do you think America will change as a result of it, or do you think they're going to go back to their old ways of oppressing black people for some reason?
Yeah, and look, there's other parts of that society as well. I think African Americans make up about 13% of the population. The Hispanic population is actually much larger, and they also probably feel pretty disadvantaged in that country as well. I think there's opportunities for change. I think really there needs to be different leadership in America for that to occur.
We're going to talk about their leadership in a bit.
Yeah, and I think until that starts to change, I can't see a lot positive happening, even though I think there's a great opportunity at the moment for it.
So what is your opinion on Donald Trump?
Ali.
Big Donald.
Yeah. I remember when he was elected.
Oh my God. It was just a state of disbelief.
Yes. I thought it was a joke. So I was teaching, I remember that day, and there were some kids in my society and culture class, really political kids, and we'd been sort of talking about it leading up to it. Oh yeah, Hillary, shoo-in sort of situation. And then as it sort of unfolded during the day, I remember this one kid coming and sort of updating me on sort of the results, and it got to a point where it was pretty obvious that Trump had won. And I couldn't believe it. I absolutely was stunned, because it seemed that at no point, and I mean, I'd watched some of his speeches and I just thought, surely even, certain parts of American society can look at that and think this is ridiculous. He is a joke. You can't say those things. That's absolutely awful. But apparently, he was elected, and I think it's shocking. My biggest fear is that after everything that has gone wrong in his term, that he'll be re-elected and we will get to experience, another cycle of
So you think
terrible.
he's going to get re-elected this year?
I'm very concerned that he will. Very concerned.
The only conclusion I could draw to his election initially was people were trying to, like, thought it was a joke, and then when it actually unfolded, they're like, oh, wait, what?
Yeah,
Wait,
and you
Trump's
sort of...
our
I know.
president?
And you sort of wonder about, the American voting system, that it's not compulsory. The amount of people who were Trump supporters, so they were adamant that they were going to go out and vote, and the amount of people who probably were sort of a bit more dismissive of his ability to win, who were like, yeah, he won't get in.
Yeah, I feel like
I'm working today, don't think I'll vote.
I feel like the majority of the people who voted were either avid Trump supporters or, I don't know, like, how can you can't really like Hillary Clinton either, can you?
I think there's a lot more to like there than in Trump. And
definitely.
I think also the fact that she was a woman would have been a real opportunity for America to start having a better representation.
They haven't had a woman president yet. That's crazy. Yeah.
No, and so even if maybe Hillary Clinton wasn't the best option, it would have been a nice change to have a female elected as president, and I think that sort of is very symbolic, in a nation's history. Julia Gillard, that was symbolic in Australian history, that she was prime minister, even though she was treated pretty dreadfully by the media. But that's hugely symbolic, and I think that those sorts of representations of diversity in leadership show progressiveness in a country. And I think the fact that America went from Barack Obama to Trump, that's regressive. It's like a step backwards.
Mm. What did you think of Obama? Because I don't really know much about him. I'm not really into American politics.
Yeah,
to be completely honest.
Look, I'm into it to a certain degree, but I couldn't speak as an authority on Barack Obama. What I will say is he certainly came across as a much more empathetic human being in a leadership role than America's probably seen for a while. And I think you only need to look at his responses after the numerous school shootings that happened under his leadership and his calls for reform around guns. And you could see that he was somebody who did care. In saying that, he's still a politician. Also, some terrible things happened economically in America under his leadership. And I mean, I've listened to a couple of podcasts that sort of infer some responsibility there, that he should have done more to regulate banks and to regulate the financial sector, which I suppose when you think about when, that crisis happened in, was it 2007, 2008, he's, at the helm. There was probably a responsibility there to maybe play a more significant role in it, in controlling it, managing it, regulating it. I think that Barack Obama's plans around healthcare for Obamacare would have been monumental changes. And I think he thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected and she was going to inherit this public policy which made healthcare similar to the way it is in Australia.
I love how healthcare in America is like a huge thing. Oh my God, healthcare.
Yeah, well,
Australians would have been like, oh, first time.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, the situation in America, that really, one of the things that people look at on employment contracts is whether or not they get insurance. The fact that you could turn up to a hospital and not be treated because you don't have health insurance.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like,
startling.
Checking in for a cold and being told just rest for a few days costs like $100. Like it's a lot of money.
Yeah, there's a lot broken in their healthcare system, and I think Obamacare was trying to change that, to have a system a little bit more aligned to the system we have in Australia, the system that exists in England, in a lot of Europe. But obviously Trump is a financial manager. He's comes from a business background, and he clearly thinks that it doesn't matter how sick you are, it matters whether or not you can afford your care. That's what matters.
Well, I want to finish off by asking you whether you think that if we stay at the political climate that we are right now in Australia, are we going into a good place, or do we need to change the way we're doing things?
I think Australia generally has been in a reasonably good place for quite a while. And even though it's easy to criticise, depending on where you fall on that political spectrum, left or right, and it's easy to criticise the government that's in power, I think generally we're pretty centred in Australia. And so even when we have a Liberal or a Labor government, I think a lot of the policies are generally for the betterment of society. Yeah, we can argue about whether or not more support should be added here or taken from there. But I don't think Australia's in a terrible political situation by any means. And, you know, even I obviously have my political beliefs, which are even inferred, even though I'm not going to state them. I don't look at sort of the management of Australia under either of those parties and feel like we're heading towards a cliff, that there's some sort of tragedy about to occur. I think Australia generally has been well managed. I haven't always agreed with all of the policies, but I feel that we're still heading in a reasonably positive trajectory.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Mess. I really appreciate it.
Do you know, it's been such a pleasure, Ali. I've had a really good time.
Thank you.
No
I appreciate that. So this has been Liaising with Ali, and until next time, Godspeed.
Nice.